What's up guys, it's Eric from Rare Candy, and today I'm going to be covering my tournament report for the recent regional held in Collinsville, Illinois. We're going to go over, what I expect to see at this event, my matchups, the deck I chose, including the actual list itself, and more in this tournament report, so let's get into it. And so this was actually a pretty big event, not only in terms of size, we had a huge turnout. I think Masters Division had around 1,100 players in total, so that's even bigger than some nationals level events in the past that we've had. But also, like I said, not only in terms of size, but because this is a pretty important regional, because this is the first weekend that Ultra Prism, the new set, was going to be allowed for play. So here in the States, we had the regional held in Illinois, and similarly, Europe had one going on at the same time as well. So these tournaments were standard format, which means it allowed sets all the way back from Breakthrough all the way up to the most recent set, Ultra Prism, like I just mentioned. So a lot of people were really excited to try out the new cards. It's always exciting to see what new cards end up having a big impact on the format, and especially in the case of Ultra Prism, there are so many new cards and archetypes and potentially playable things that could make an impact on the game. A lot of people, like I said, were super excited to see how the set was going to impact the metagame. And even though there were a ton of new archetypes that are being hyped up, I think a lot of old decks still honestly were positioned the best in the metagame. So coming into this event, there was a handful of decks that I really expected to see pop up at this event. So previously, some of the more popular decks that I thought remain to be good in this new format were going to be Zoroark variants, whether it be with Golisopod or Lycanroc, Gardevoir variants, which I think got a bit of a boost because of the new Cynthia card. Also, we had things like Super Boost Energy pop up in this set as well. We had Buzzwole, which honestly I thought was going to be the best deck from the previous format coming into this new Ultra Prism based format. And actually, there's some old decks that people, kind of forgot about that I think were getting some hype to make a resurgence, and that was going to be Greninja Break. That was kind of the big one I think that people were really talking about a lot leading up to this event. Previously in the past, Greninja had all sorts of consistency issues. You had to run 4 copies of Sycamore, which honestly is a terrible card in Greninja because you normally have a lot of hands you don't want to Sycamore away. So having Cynthia now at its disposal, Greninja had a lot of hype coming into this event. Also Garbodor variants too, because of the hype that Buzzwole had. People were talking about Espeon Garbodor. Similarly, also some other Garbodor variants featuring Buzzwole as well. So all sorts of old decks, like I said, I think look to be primed for success coming into this new format. But honestly, looking at the new decks, I didn't really expect many of them to be that popular. I think a lot of the archetypes that people were trying out were solid, but not the type of decks that would win tournaments. I think the only one that I expected to see a lot of play would be Duskmane and Necrozma GX with Magnezone, since it's kind of comparable to Tapu Bulu, which is a solid deck in the current format. So I think a lot of people might have potentially brought that deck to the tournament. But honestly, after testing, I wasn't expecting a whole lot of Glaceon or Leafeon, or even like Empoleon or Garchomp either. I think those are probably some of the more hyped new archetypes. So coming into this event, the decks I had on my mind to try to beat were going to be kind of all these decks that I just listed, and that kind of helped shape the deck choice that I decided to go with for this event. So then that begs the question, well, what deck did I actually play? And so leading up to this event, one of the big decks I kind of always had in my back pocket that I was prepared to play was Gardevoir GX. I've had a decent amount of success with it this season. I've topped a couple cups with it, did pretty well at Memphis Regionals, got top 64 with it. And it's just a deck that I've really enjoyed playing. It's kind of my ideal playstyle. I love stage 2 decks, of course, that way we can abuse rare candy. Who doesn't love a deck with rare candy? But yeah, so that was one of the big decks that I always kind of knew I could fall back on if I didn't find anything I liked. But the big problem was Buzzwole GX, I think, was honestly the best deck from the previous format coming into this new Ultra Prism format. And with this regional being so close to a lot of events that were going on for the previous format, honestly, I think a lot of people didn't have enough time to test and really break this new Ultra Prism format. So honestly, I was expecting a lot of Buzzwole to be at the event, which did coming true, which scared me off because Gardevoir in the past has not had a great Buzzwole matchup. Just the deck is too aggressive. You can win, but I think it's definitely favored for Buzzwole. So that kind of deterred me from playing Gardevoir. And also, I had some bad luck at a couple of League Cups recently too. So I really needed to make sure that I got championship points from this event to stay on track to get my Worlds invite. And I was just honestly too afraid of playing a Stage 2 deck at this event. So unfortunately, I had to kind of cross Gardevoir off my list. Even though I love the deck, I just didn't think it was the safest play for this particular event. So with that in mind, I had to start looking at other different options for this new format. I played a decent amount of different Ultra Prism decks. As you saw on the channel, I was testing out, quite a few different ideas, and honestly not a whole lot was sticking. There was a couple of decks that I liked, but I didn't love. I didn't think they were, I thought they were good. You can maybe top cut, maybe a League Cup with them or something like that, but I didn't think they had enough potential to win a regional or do well at a regional. So I kind of really didn't like any of the new archetypes that we're seeing hype, like Leafeon variants, Glaceon, and the Magnezone deck. I just wasn't feeling any of them. So looking at the format that I expected to see, like I said, I expected a lot of Buzzwole. I still expected a lot of Zoroark. Expected some Greninja. There was some hype around that. Expected Tapu Bulu. So I wanted to pick a deck that I felt like could go toe-to-toe with all of those decks and also any of the new decks that might pop up at the regional. Even though, like I said, I didn't think any of the new decks would win the regional, I still expected some to show up, which was true as well. The Duskmane Necrozma Magnezone deck did have a pretty decent showing as far as the amount of people playing it from what I could see. So I wanted to be prepared to at least be able to beat any of these new decks and also have good matchups against these old archetypes. And the main deck from the previous format that I really had my eye on was going to be Espeon GX Garbodor, which honestly is a deck I cannot stand. I don't enjoy playing Garbodor variants. I think they are very stressful. They're very grindy. They're just not fun decks to play. I've never enjoyed them, but I couldn't let my own personal preferences, I guess, kind of get in the way of my potential performance at this event. So I had to consider Espeon Garbodor. Your Psychic type, so obviously you do well against Buzzwole variants. You have Garbodor, so you don't have to tech the Tina promo in to beat Greninja. If that did show up, you have good matches against all of the new archetypes. So honestly, I had to consider Espeon Garbodor. It's a deck I started playing around with a couple days leading up to the event, just testing it out here and there, and it was a deck that I felt like had some potential. And the other deck that I was actually testing a bit leading up to the event was a different Duskmane Necrozma deck that was based around Registeel and Max Elixir, kind of like a turbo metal version of the deck. That kind of played more similarly to Volcanion, and honestly that deck was doing surprisingly well for me, and I was playing with it and testing it even up until the day before the event, just trying to get more and more games in with it just to see how it would fare. So those were my two front runners for the weekend. I felt like both these decks were strong enough to go toe-to-toe with a lot of these decks that I just mentioned. But ultimately the deck I decided to go with was Espeon Garbodor. So there's a couple of reasons why I decided to go with Espeon over this Turbo Metal deck that I was testing. So the first is that it's honestly just an established archetype. I think people have had refined lists for this deck for a while, and not much really changes with Ultra Prism. We of course got the new Cynthia, which is another draw supporter that we can make use of. But other than that, everything pretty much stays the same, which I think is a good thing because that ensures that getting a solid list for this event wouldn't be that difficult. I felt pretty confident I could play a list that really didn't leave much room for improvement. I still feel that way about the list that I ultimately decided on. Me and a couple guys from my area were testing this, and we all played I think all within like one card of each other. So the list that I decided on I think was fine. So that was one reason I chose Espeon over this Turbo Metal deck, just because, like I said, it's an established archetype, so making a good list I think would be easy. And also, I was kind of afraid of Greninja, and I really just did not want to play a deck that needed the Giratina promo, and I wanted to either play something that had a good Greninja matchup without a Giratina promo, or a deck that played Garbotoxin. I just did not want to play any kind of useless techs in my list. I've done this before. I mean, it's definitely the safe thing to do at a big event like this, but I just really did not want to waste any slots in my deck on matchups that I might not even run into where a card is completely useless. So that is another reason why I ultimately decided on Espeon GX. So let's look at this list that I ended up playing this weekend. So a lot of it looks really standard. If anyone's played Espeon GX Garbodor in the past, like I said, this will look pretty standard. A couple of noteworthy inclusions. We do play the one Drampa GX, of course. This is not a Drampa Garbodor deck, and we are not playing Potown. We are playing a heavy count of Parallel City, so Drampa is not the main focus, but Drampa is actually pretty nice in certain matchups. Righteous Edge is a great attack against Zoroark decks and any deck that really runs special energies, and also can be a heavy hitter against decks that don't knock you out in one hit as well. We're playing the one copy of Espeon EX. It's honestly, I think you're only out to beating Gardevoir, assuming you just don't shut them out of the game with a Garbotoxin super early or something like that. So assuming you play against a Gardevoir deck that sets up kind of normally, Espeon EX I think is honestly your only way to really take care of that matchup, especially without Potowns. That is kind of our only real tech in this list. Everything else pretty straightforward. And Espeon EX honestly is a card I wish I didn't even play this past weekend. It was the most useless card in the entire deck. Didn't run into any Gardevoir variants, but you know, in hindsight, you know, it can still be sometimes useful to de-evolve certain stage ones like Zoroarks and Lycanrocs and things like that. So you know, it still makes sense in the list. It's not like a useless card like Giratina promo, but it was the one card, if I could, you know, kind of look back and change, that would be the one card I would definitely, without question, change in this list. A couple of other noteworthy things. We have 3 copies of Pariseau City. Like I mentioned, Pariseau City I think is one of the best cards in the format, including the previous format in Crimson Invasion, and that still did not change with this new Ultra Prism format. I still love Pariseau City. It's just such an oppressive card to have, especially in a deck that plays Garbodor. I think Pariseau City Garbodor N is just one of the most oppressive combos that you can get off on your opponent. Ability lock, ending them to a low hand size, and limiting their bench size all at the same time is just so strong. And playing the heavy count of Pariseau City ensures that you open with it or can find it early on in the game. Because there's so many games where if you go first and have Pariseau City in your opening hand, just throw it down. It kind of takes the, you know, the Lele for Bridget option away from your opponent a lot of times and forces them to play, you know, other supporters to get set up and things like that. Also good, just against a number of decks, Zoroark is so popular, limiting their bench size not only disrupts them, but, you know, limits their damage output. The other side of Pariseau City also is useful against certain decks like Tapu Bulu and Volcanion to reduce their damage output. So definitely, I think, one of the MVPs of the deck. Everything else, like I said, pretty straightforward. But honestly, I think that's one thing, like I said, I liked about this deck. I felt like getting a solid Espeon list would be pretty easy for this weekend, so that is why we decided on this list. Now, of course, like I said, if I was going to cut anything or change anything, cards that I did want to include were Enhanced Hammer. That was a card that was previously in this list that a couple of the guys I was with were playing with, but I ended up cutting that for the third Pariseau City just because Parallel is super good. But I would like to find room for the one Enhanced Hammer, definitely a good card. A 4th Choice Band is also consideration, and also a Tauros GX could have been good against Golisopod variants, just because that is one of your not so good matchups. So I think that could have been a good card to include as well. So those are the 3 cards I would have loved to have found a spot for in this deck. But overall, really happy with the list I played. Pretty straightforward deck. I felt pretty confident about the quality of the list going into this event. So let's head over into my actual matchups, and I'll take you through how my day went at this tournament. So round 1, I'm playing against a Leafeon GX Lurantis deck, and as soon as my opponent gets out Leafeon, and I think he actually started with a Fomantis, you know, I was pretty excited because this deck is really good against that. Pariseau City is just super bad for Leafeon. Also, the Garbotoxin lock pretty much just nullifies every advantage that Leafeon and its partners have. So I felt honestly really comfortable about this matchup. But game 1, my opponent opens with a Fomantis, Sycamores their hand away, and they don't find another basic, but they attached a Grass Energy to their Fomantis, so all I had to do was attach double Colorless Energy to my active Lele and just knock it out. So I donked my opponent game 1, and then game 2, it kind of went about how I expected. You know, I got the Garbotoxin lock, the Pariseau City. My opponent did start to make a bit of a comeback in terms of taking prizes, but my board state was just too oppressive, and I ended up taking game 2 as well. So starting off the day with a win felt really great. Hurt me to take down a Leafeon deck. Leafeon, I've said it before, is one of my favorite cards out of Ultra Prism. I just really enjoy the card design and how the card works. So definitely it hurt me a little to take down a Leafeon, but you gotta do what you gotta do. And starting off the day 1-0 felt really nice. Going on to round 2, I play against a Zoroark GX, Lycanroc GX deck. Kind of a deck I expected to see at this event. Pretty used to playing against at this point. So in game 1 of the series, you know, I set up, from what I can remember, pretty decently. I end up getting a Pariseau City in play and a Garbodor at some point as well. But I do remember there was a pivotal point in this series where my opponent, or in this game I should say, where my opponent Field Blowers away my Parallel City and parallels me, which was actually really bad because I was relying on Tapu Lele to grab me a supporter for the next turn. So my opponent's Parallel City took that play away from me, and I was left with not much to work with for a few turns, and that really just opened up a big opportunity for my opponent to jump back and kind of get ahead of me in terms of their setup. So game one, we played honestly a pretty long game one. Debatably, I could have scooped it earlier, but it was still pretty close at one point. After I finally got a supporter and got back into the game, I ended up getting pretty close, but I forget what happened at the end of the game. I think I whiffed something in order to put myself in a good position to win the game, and my opponent, sealed it up. And unfortunately, game one took a pretty long time. And even playing game two, I just couldn't really get set up ideally, and my opponent looked like he was going to win that game either way, but I don't believe game two even completed from what I remember. So unfortunately, had to take a loss around two. It's always unfortunate to take a loss or a tie this early on into the event. You want to ideally just be able to take your loss or ties at the very end once you've already won a bunch and kind of secured your spot for day two. But unfortunately, that was not the case. Super nice guy I played against, though. So that's always good. If you're going to lose, it's at least nice to have good company. So next round, I am playing against a Volcanion deck. So when I saw my opponent shuffling up, I believe I saw some Fire Energy, which I was excited about. Honestly, I think Espeon has a fine matchup against Volcanion. You can one-shot their Volcanions and Ho-Ohs and things like that, just because they have to commit a lot of energy, and the math works out really nicely for your Espeons. Also, they typically play a ton of items, so Trash Range is normally a great attack in the deck as well. Parallel City, also very good. So a lot of good things going on, for this matchup. But game one, so I remember my opponent opens with a Ho-Oh and gets the first turn. Kiawe seems pretty good. And on my turn, I whiff the energy to be able to use an energy drive to do 120 to the Ho-Oh. So I think I just had to just get a couple Pokemon in play and pass. And on the next turn, I believe my opponent just kind of knocked out my Tapu Lele. And my opponent just had a super aggressive game, and he was just putting on a ton of early game pressure, which is one thing this Espeon Garbodor deck definitely has a hard time dealing with. It's kind of a slower deck. Your turn one is normally bridge it, attach, pass, or something to that effect. Your attackers don't really do a whole lot of damage until the late game. So even though I think this is a good matchup, just my opponent's early game pressure they were putting on was just way too much, and they took game one. I forget what happened game two, but I eventually won that one, and we went on to a game three where I opened up double Trubbish and nothing else. And I thought for sure that I was going to be done for. My opponent opened with, of course, I think it was the Ho-Oh with the turn one Kiawe. So my opponent was putting on a ton of pressure. I eventually do top deck a Sycamore before I ended up losing, and I was able to jump back into the game. But honestly, my opponent's setup was just way too out of control for me by the time I really had anything going. And at this point, I'm playing for a time, just trying to stay alive and make sure my opponent doesn't win at this point. So I'm just trying to make sure my stuff doesn't get knocked out, and time eventually did get called, and we eventually did tie. I do think my opponent probably would have won that game had time not gotten called. And honestly, I don't know if a loss or a tie at this point really makes much of a difference, because you have to be 7-2 or better to make day two of the tournament. So there's not a big difference between a loss and a tie anyway. So even if I did end up losing that game, I wouldn't have felt too bad about it, just because, like I said, the difference between a tie and a loss at this event really isn't that big. So I was a little bummed out for, kind of not doing that well against a favorable matchup round three. So when I saw on round four my opponent flips over a Buzzwole, I am ecstatic. I'm like, yes, this is one reason I played Espeon. Buzzwole I thought was going to be one of the best decks going into this event, and having a deck that could deal with that easily was really important to me. So as soon as I saw a Buzzwole, I was like, yes, I finally got my free win of the day, basically. But unfortunately, that is not at all how this went. So in game one, I remember we played a very, very long game one, and my opponent got a turn two Guzma Absorption GX to knock out my Espeon GX on my bench, which really set me back. That is a ton of pressure to be putting on. Even though Buzzwole is weak to Psychic, that's a lot for this deck to deal with. Like I said, very heavy early aggression, like in the case of that Ho-Oh and Turn 1 Kiawe, like I just mentioned, can be bad for this deck since it is very slow and grindy. But nevertheless, I'm feeling pretty good. I have a Psychic deck. I should be able to deal with Buzzwole. So next turn, I get out another Espeon and confuse this active Buzzwole. And my opponent flips through the confusion to do like 190 damage to my Espeon. It doesn't knock it out, but he heavily damages my Espeon. Had he flipped Tails there, I definitely think I would have been in a good spot the rest of the game, since this Espeon could have gone, a pretty big distance in terms of taking a lot of prizes. But flipping through the confusion was really big, so this one Buzzwole is just putting in so much work against my deck, even though like I said, I should have a good matchup against it. And I'm doing everything I can to stay in the game. We honestly had a super close game. My opponent prized his second Lycanroc to whiff, sealing up the game. And at that point, honestly, I felt pretty good. All I had to do was take out their Lycanroc GX, which was heavily damaged at one point, and I was basically good to go from there. But I remembered I got the Garbotoxin lock, end my opponent, and he top decks like the last Guzma in his deck 4-game to take a knockout. And so I lost a super long game 1, and at that point I was honestly kind of on tilt. Like I said, I was playing Espeon because it has a good Buzzwole matchup, and if I felt like this series was being stolen from me. Nothing against my opponent, super nice guy, but I just felt like, this was supposed to be my free win. I was going to be good to go for this round. And then game 2, it doesn't even complete just because game 1 did take so long. And unfortunately, that means I lost the series against Buzzwole. This is supposed to be, like I said, my auto win. So after this round, I was honestly kind of upset. I've been knocked out of day 2 of events before. It hasn't been a huge deal. It's never fun, but you don't want to get knocked out of day 2 to a favorable matchup because, like I said, you had to go 7-2 or better at this event to make day 2, and now I am 1-2-1, which is pretty bad. So unfortunately, I am knocked out of contention for day 2, but I have to kind of stay positive because if I win out, I can still get top 64 potentially, or top 128, or even top 256, and still get some championship points. So unfortunately, I still have to play out the rest of the games for my day. So I'm going to try to bring it back and see if I can at least get some championship points from this event. So up next for round 5, I play against a Salazzle GX Garbodor deck. Very interesting. Really was not something I was prepared to go against, so I was having trouble figuring out what I should do in this matchup, kind of figuring the matchup out as I went through it, because I really didn't know what to expect out of this deck. But luckily, I think it's actually favored for me because Garbodor is pretty useless against my deck because I'm also trying to lock abilities. And also, Salazzle GX plays into Drampa very nicely. So what you can do is you can easily get 30 damage on a Salazzle, or use Divide GX to set up 20 on a bunch of different Salazzles or Salandits, and then you can use a Choice Banded Drampa to actually just one-shot Salazzles the rest of the game. So game 1, I remember I was doing pretty well in I knocked out my opponent's only Salazzle GX, and they had prized their 2 other Salazzles. So he scooped. We went to game 2, and didn't do much better. He was kind of having a hard time getting going, and I ended up winning game 2 as well. So I'm bringing it back. I'm 2-2-1 at this point. Like I said, I have to win out basically if I want to have a chance at top 64. So I'm feeling good. I finally got a win after losing to Buzzwole. Like I said, my spirits were in bad shape, so I needed the win here definitely. Going on to round 6, I'm playing against another new archetype from Ultra Prism, playing against Duskmane Necrozma Magnezone. And like I said earlier, I feel like Espeon Garbodor has a good matchup against all of these new archetypes. Paralycity plus Garbotoxin is super good against Duskmane. Also, just as silly as it sounds, Psybeam, Espeon's first attack to confuse your opponent, is a pretty good attack. So if you have, let's just say, Garbotox in play and your opponent has a Duskmane Necrozma in the active spot, you can just confuse them, and they have such a heavy retreat cost, it's really difficult for them to actually deal with it. Especially if they just used Meteor Tempest to take a knockout and they go down to 1 energy on their Duskmane, you have Garbotoxin and they're confused. They're really in a hard position to deal with what you have going on. It sounds silly, but the confusion is just so big against a lot of decks like this. And honestly, I forget how our series went. I remember my opponent, super nice guy yet again, but I just forget how these matches played out. But I ended up winning the series as well. So I'm on the comeback. I'm 3-2-1 at this point. Took down, like I said, another matchup I felt pretty good about. So just trying to keep my streak going and hopefully hit some more good matchups to, close out this day on a good note. And next up, played against another Buzzwole deck, and honestly, I was kind of scared to play against it because it had me thinking after round 4, maybe this matchup isn't as good as I previously thought. But honestly, I think all it is my opponent round 4 did really well. He got the turn 2 Absorption GX on a Espeon, flipped well for his confusion. So honestly, I think I was just a little scared based off how I did round 4. But round 7, like I said, played against another Buzzwole deck, and this one went a little bit more in my favor. Game 1 took a while to complete. Honestly, it was pretty close. My opponent was using Zygarde a lot of the time, just because it's not weak to Psychics, weak to Grass. So he was doing, kind of the right thing there, avoiding being hit for weakness. He also flipped through some confusion flips at some point, which kind of turned the game in his favor a little bit. But I ended up squeaking out the win for game 1. It was pretty close, and I forget how game 2 went, but I ended up winning the series against a Buzzwole deck, and I felt pretty good. Like I said, I felt really bad after losing to it earlier, but finally got my win against another Buzzwole deck. Round 8, yet another Buzzwole deck is what I'm playing against, and like I said, I'm feeling a little bit better after round 7, and so game 1, my opponent's playing a bunch of interesting things. I ended up seeing Carbink hit the board at some point. Carbink Break, I should specify. He also played the Watch and Learn Sudowoodo. So he had some surprises in there I did not play against earlier in the day. So I was trying to, kind of keep those in mind as we were going through the matchup. Game 1, I honestly forget how this game played out. I ended up winning that one. Game 2, I do remember that. Though I start with an Eevee and like a Trubbish or something to that effect, and I go to N or Cynthia or something, and I whiff the energy to evolve into Espeon and confuse my opponent's Buzzwole. So they just use Jet Punch to take a knockout on the Eevee, and I promote another Eevee I had on the bench. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to Cynthia again or N or whatever Shuffle Draw supporter I played, and I'm going to get Espeon, everything's going to be fine. With the Psychic Energy again. And so my second Eevee goes down, and from there I'm forced to. I think I finally got Espeon GX in play the next turn, and started putting some pressure on my opponent. But honestly, my opponent just got a really nice early lead. He was set up a lot better than me, and he ended up winning that one. So we go into a game 3, and I end up taking that game. I do kind of forget what happened in that one. My opponent, I think, scooped about halfway in. He just was not having the best setup, and honestly, my deck was just firing on all cylinders, just getting set up the way it's meant to, and I ended up taking another series against Buzzwole Lycanroc. So going into the very last round of the day, I am, at this point, 5-2-1, so all I have to do is win one more, and I could potentially make top 64, winning some packs and getting some championship points, to walk away with this weekend. And so round 9, I play against my first Glaceon deck of the tournament, and I played against a Glaceon GX Zoroark GX deck. And I remember when me and my opponent were setting up, and I flipped over my Trubbish or whatever I had, he told me he had beaten 3 other of these Espeon Garbodor decks throughout the day, which has me worried because I have a long history, if you've seen any of my other tournament reports, of making it all the way to my win in round 9 or the last game of the day to get points or to make day 2, and I end up choking and losing somehow. So whenever he said that, I was like, no, this is gonna happen again. I'm gonna lose and miss points and all this stuff. So initially I was worried. I thought he was playing Sylveon just because that actually would be kind of an annoying matchup to deal with, but I saw him attach the Water Energy going to Glaceon, and I felt honestly pretty good about my situation because I play Garbotoxin, so I can shut off the Zoroark, which is going to be very important for my opponent. Drampa GX also very, very good in this matchup because they put a lot of damage on your board without taking one-hit knockouts, so that sets up a lot of Berserks for you. So honestly, I think my deck is favored going into this matchup. I play the heavy count of Parallel City, which really hurts my opponent, limiting the damage output of his Zoroarks. Tapu Lele is also a great attacker in this matchup. I even opted to start with a Lele in one game where I didn't have to, just because DCE Lele just hits a Glaceon for 100, and you can deal with the matchup, I think, just in that way alone. So game 1, I honestly forget how these games went. Like I said, it's a long weekend, guys. I apologize for forgetting some of the details. But I remember, like I said, being a little worried going into this match. But like I said, once I saw Glaceon, I felt pretty good. And I ended up winning a game 1. And then game 2 was super, super close from what I remember. It went all the way to time. But I ended up winning on the last turn of time. So either way, even if the game tied, I still would have won the series because I won a long game 1. So I closed out my day with a 6-2-1 record, which seems to be story of my life. I'm always literally just like one game away from making day 2 at these major events. So it's another one to go down in the books for whiffing day 2. But overall, still really happy with how my deck performed. Like I said, I like the list, other than maybe a little bit of bad luck here and there, or maybe not scooping games early enough. I still really enjoyed how this deck played over the weekend. And so for the final standings of this tournament, honestly, the top 8 wasn't that exciting to look at. Just in terms of the decks that ended up topping. They're all kind of old decks that did well in the previous format. Some of them played some new tricks, like Cynthia, of course. But overall, it's a lot of the same stuff that we saw in the Crimson Invasion format. And like I said earlier in the video, I kind of expect that just because I think a lot of players didn't have time to test for this event because there were so many other big events happening right before this one. And I thought a lot of people, would want to play a safer deck going into an unknown format without a whole lot of testing. So that's kind of what we saw. So if we're looking here at the top 8 at the number 1 spot, Zoroark Golispot ended up winning the entire tournament. But also we had a Buzzwole Garbodor deck get 2nd, Buzzwole Lycanroc get 3rd, Zoroark Lycanroc get 4th, Zoroark Golispot get 5th, Volcanion get 6th, Buzzwole Lycanroc get 7th, and another Zoroark Golispot get 8th. And so for me, I ended up winding up getting 88th for the day with the Espeon Garbodor. Still, I think a pretty good accomplishment out of like 1,100 people. I felt pretty good. I was at the top 8% of players or something there that day, so I felt pretty good about how I finished. A little bummed that I whiffed top 64. 621 did make top 64, but there were just a lot of people with 621, and I ended up whiffing, getting top 64. I still got championship points, it's just not quite as much as the top 64 players did, and they also got booster packs for prize support. But like I said, overall, happy with my deck choice, happy with the list that I played. Honestly happy overall with my performance. I honestly just needed to get some points from this event to stay on track to get my Worlds invite. If you follow Rare Candy on Twitter, you saw I showed up late to a League Cup the weekend before and got a round 1 loss. Then I got paired against a bad matchup and lost immediately my first real game of the day, so I had to drop from that tournament because I couldn't make cut at that point. And the next day I had a weird situation where like my game got put in the computer incorrectly and that knocked me out of top cut. So all this weird stuff had been happening to me where I was whiffing, making top cut and getting points at cups. So I just really needed some points this weekend to stay on track for my invite. And right now, I think at the time of filming, I'm at like 220 something or something like that. I forget off the top of my head. But like I said, overall happy with how this weekend turned out. And another thing I just want to give a shout to is honestly all of you guys that I ran into at the tournament. Typically I honestly don't get that much attention at these major events just because, a lot of times I don't actually have my face showing in videos. We do videos like this where I'm just kind of narrating over video or images and stuff like that. So I was honestly really surprised by how many people recognized me and came up to me and, said nice things about the channel. So if you're watching this and I ran into you, thanks so much for saying hi. I got to sign some mats and cards, which I'm not used to at all. So that was that was kind of fun. So if you want your rare candy signed in the future, holla at your boy at the next regional. Another thing that I thought was super awesome, I saw a ton of people with rare candy themed playmats and dice bags and things like that. So it was super cool to see, all the items that we have in the online store actually being used out in the wild at tournaments. So that was honestly something I felt like that was really cool. So just a big shout out to everyone who's been supporting the channel by being a patron or by picking up stuff from our online store. Stuff like that really goes a long way. And like I said, it's awesome to see at these big events too. So that's going to be a wrap for this regional. I am planning on going to some other ones this season. I'm going to be at the Charlotte, North Carolina regional since it's really close to where I live. I live in South Carolina, so it's not that far of a drive for me. Also should be at Virginia as well. Not looking forward to that one as much because it is expanded, but hey, I still need the championship points, so I will be there. And I should also be at internationals this year as well. Not sure if there's any other events I'll be making it to. Those should be the rest of the major events that I'll be going to for the rest of the year, unless I'm just not doing well at cups and I need some extra championship points or something like that. That should be where you guys can say hi in the future if you do run into me at any of those events. And also, of course, feel free to like and subscribe, and if you can support this channel by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or by picking up something from our online store at rarecandytcg.com, it would mean a lot. But with that, I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you for the next one.